they're not naturally formed. There's no natural process that dumps 30 pounds of iron, nickel, et cetera, in the middle of a field, above which was seen what can only be described of as a UFO. Okay, so why? What is it? The anecdotes are preliminary data. And as I've talked many times, I've had my own experiences of a variety of types, sporadic, but indisputable. But stories are not science.
Mm-hmm.
Individual stories, especially, are not science. All they can do is provide a kind of fuel for me to want to understand what it was that I saw. And then secondarily, I want to use science to convince other people that, hey, there was something here that was worth studying. And it's a bigger thing because I'm not the only one who saw exactly the kinds of things I saw. So science is about repeatability. There is repeatability. It's just not on call. There's repeated observations of similar things. That's repeatability.
And welcome back to another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. It's Luciano here speaking as your host as usual. Before we get into it here with our next guest, Garry Nolan, I want to remind the listener, veteran and new. Number one, check out our website. You'll see all the cache of discussions that we've been having, but also take the time to like, share, subscribe, and all the good stuff. Our regular listeners know that we're a not-for-profit, registered charity as well. We do this for the fun of exploring the what-ifs and the why-nots with people who are actually doing that. And so for us, that's the end game. And the end game is a long one. We're thankful for it. So if you're so inclined to check us out, and also donate, as we're a charity, as mentioned, you can go to our website and find out all that good stuff, behindgreatness.org. And a big thank you for coming on and giving us your auditory companionship. Here we go. So we have another special guest. His name is Dr. Garry Nolan. So Dr. Garry Nolan is the Ratchford and Carlotta A. Harris Professor in the Department of Pathology at Stanford University School of Medicine. He has, among many other things, published over 330 research articles and is the holder of 50 U.S. patents and has been honored as one of the top 25 inventors, maybe we'll talk about that too, inventors at Stanford University. He is a first recipient of the Teal Innovator Award 2012 from the Department of Defense, which was a $3.3 million grant for advanced studies in ovarian cancer. First recipient of the quote-unquote bioagent protection grant, $3 million from the FDA for a cross-species immune system reference, and this goes on and on and on. And we'll put the bio as well in the show notes. Dr. Nolan's efforts are to enable a deeper understanding not only of normal immune function, trauma, pathogen infection, and other inflammatory events, but also detailed substructures of leukemias and solid cancers and their interactions with the immune system, which will enable wholly new understandings that will enable better management of disease and clinical outcomes. And wholly would be WHOLLY. Dr. Nolan is also an outspoken proponent of translating public investment in basic research to serve the public welfare. He is an investor and an owner in companies that are on the NASDAQ or sold then into the NASDAQ, into that sphere. And he is also a member of the Parker Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy at Stanford. And lastly, also a founder of Soul Foundation. And we'll put the Soul Foundation info in the show notes. Welcome to the program, Garry.
Thank you very much. And thanks to your listeners for spending some time with us.
We've been waiting a while on this, and we know that you're an extremely busy guy and very public. Especially since coming out after Diana Pasulka's book. Let's start off this way. The listener will know by this time, we'll check out the show notes if they're curious enough, and I'm sure they will be. What is the Soul Foundation?
The Soul Foundation is an academic policy institute directed towards, in some ways, legitimizing the discussion around what UAP are, but frankly, just trying to figure out what they are. Much of the time that I've spent publicly talking about UAP and what they might be has been around setting a framework for how the public can talk about it in a manner that a scientist would do. And it's not because the public doesn't know how to talk about things. It's just that we assign higher credit and value to scientific discourse than rumor and gossip or anecdote. And so I've, for instance, spent time talking about it's the data, not the conclusion. Don't jump to a conclusion because conclusions can be disproven very easily. But if you can convince somebody else, especially a scientist, that the data is real, the onus is no longer on you to provide the answer. You can basically say, well, what do you think the data means? And by engaging other scientists in that level of discussion, you find a much greater, let's say, take or hit rate on the other person saying, okay. And that's all I ever really want to be able to do with other scientists is get them to say,
You've also mentioned that you are interested in, let me actually just write here, in noticing the points that are off the curve, which
Right.
which doesn't sound extraordinary. I mean, any scientist, and I say extraordinary loosely here, any scientist would want to do that, would want to explore something that's deviating from the norm.
You'd be surprised. The ideal of what people think a scientist is very rarely what happens in practice. If only because, you get caught in a loop of funding requirements that you're more likely to get funded for things that are on the line than that are off the line. And so the further off the line you go in terms of following, let's say, your intuition or an observation, the much harder it is to convince somebody else that your observation is, or your interpretation of the observation is real. There's plenty of scientists who you could talk to who will give you a litany of times that a very good idea that either they had or they know a colleague had was never brought to fruition because of this herd mentality that you get. But there's a different thing than noticing that something's off the curve. It's very easy to say, oh, that data point's off the curve. But to immediately see a potential reason why it is and why it makes the standard model of what you might be using maybe fall apart, or see it as an opportunity. And so it's just something, pat myself on the back, I'm just good at. And saying, okay, and knowing that there's something behind it that is worth following up on, or that calls into question everything that you thought you were doing. And so, it's basically allowing the blinders to be off, but you can't follow down it's just this notion of, is that worth following?
Right.
And so you're right. It should be something that any scientist would be able to jump at, but the majority of scientists are unfortunately not that way.
So, that's a pretty frank and straightforward answer, and I didn't expect anything different. You did say at the beginning of that response, you mentioned following intuition, and that I'm going to put my own assumptions into this question here. A scientist who is looking for a grant or looking to maneuver politically in those circles in order to get permission to research would want to, maybe if they're passionate about something, would want to explain how they're following their intuition, but following intuition doesn't sell the project. But here's the hypocrisy with human beings is we honor and admire experts and professionals because they have that something a little bit more, a little bit extra. And so we've learned from people that like Iya Whiteley, who actually studies how people make decisions using their professional intuition. So these are people that we entrust others with their lives. And those are people who use their intuition as professionals. Why are,
Correct.
again, I might be asking a silly question here, but why are we taking that out of the equation from scientists potentially who can study things that nobody else knows yet?
I mean, they just call it something different. I mean, or for instance, I'm good at at hiding my intent behind the cloak of real science. That I understand how to set up experimental protocols or papers and write papers that create a foundation of knowledge, even though I wouldn't reveal what my true long-term intent is in the papers. I wouldn't write it as such. So the work that we've done on a brain region in the basal ganglia, the caudate putamen, is an example of that. We did very legitimate research with a lab at Harvard around the functions of this and the dysfunctions of it in autism and schizophrenia. But the study was instigated by the work I had done with Kit Green on seeing that there were changes in the head of the caudate putamen that were correlated with high functioning individuals and, frankly, intuition. And so the revealing moment of our aha moment, our intuition, that this was somehow involved, was the observation that a couple of brain scans that Kit had from alleged or claimed high functioning remote viewers. And for your audience who doesn't know, remote viewing is sort of the clairvoyance, the ability to see things at a distance that the government has studied,
Yes.
the Stargate program.
We've had Dean Radin and others as well on the show. So yeah, our regular listener knows. Yeah.
That when we saw that, it was the aha moment, for me at least, but also for Kit and Jock, who were there at the time, that, okay, that is what's going on here. This is a center of some sort of processing that coordinates the antenna. At that time, even though we realized that, then we went and looked into the literature, the actual mainstream literature, and lo and behold, other people, though not talking about psi at all and having no intent to do so, had come to the conclusion that this area was involved in intuition and aha moments, and was a nonlinear compute center, if you will, because there's two kinds of ways to approach things. There's the linear approach where you write down all the equations, and when you get to the end of the equation, the answer is 42, right? And so, though other people will have a problem that they're solving, and then out of the blue they get the answer, and they have no idea how it came to them. And so, in a way, that's a form of what you might think of, if you want to believe it, as it might be a form of remote viewing for some people. They're seeing the answer at a distance. It might also be just entirely, earth-based, and it's just little gnomes running around in your head, figuring things out in your subconscious, and they just finally, when they're done, they bring it up, they throw it up, and you have to be distracted enough to not be paying any attention to see that this thing just hit you in the face. And then you realize, oh, that's what it is. So, but to study that, I couldn't publish a paper, or I couldn't get a grant that said, hey, I'm looking at the potential of psi. No, what I do is I go out and I collect all the raw data, map all the regions, see if the initial assumption is true about caudate putamen relationships, and lo and behold, we found in an independent cohort, in a fully controlled manner, age and sex matched controls, that indeed it was the case that this area was associated with higher intelligence. But we pitched it against looking at something, schizophrenics and autists, both of whom have different kinds of perception or abilities. Schizophrenics may be seeing things that aren't there, but maybe they have a little bit more access to something. If you want to go onto and to the woo side, and
Mhm.
maybe they just can't turn it off. And that's why they end up with mental health problems. And then on the other side, you've got autists who have remarkable savant abilities like math and things that, again, just can't be explained. How can they figure out the square root of blah, 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 to the
Sure.
20th decimal point in a second? I mean, again, that doesn't require psychic powers. But as it turned out, in both those classification types, they had deficits in the formation and structure of their basal ganglia, particularly the caudate. But what we were doing is we were mapping larger brain regions because we know it's not just going to be one thing. There's going to be all kinds of other systems changes. And so it was just getting a baseline. And the lab with whom I was working fully understood what my side interests were, but they saw the value of what we could bring in terms of the mapping, et cetera, that satisfied their need for mainstream science. It satisfied my need for mainstream science, but it then also gives me sort of a paper trail that I can point to when I want to go to other stuff to say, hey, look, I'm not just jumping into this field out of the blue. I've actually done some work in it. That's the idea, how to couch what you're doing in standard science that is validatable and unassailable.
Unassailable, I completely get it. And it's, in my opinion, I don't know. Like, again, what the hell do I know? Unassailable is unfortunately a word that I need to hear, or that we need to hear, because it's about, as you rightly put, the data. But your intent, you used intent a couple of times. Your intent is based on, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, so you correct me, please, is based on your belief that there is something more.
Let's not use the word belief,
Okay, go.
because that, first of all, is clouded and weighted with religious overtone.
Hmm.
So I don't want to go. I don't want to go there. But I'd rather pitch it as how scientists write grants. So I'll write a grant based on a hunch, based on what is called preliminary data. The
Yeah.
preliminary
Okay.
data is an experiment. It's not a conclusion. It's something that suggests and allows reasonably for a hypothesis to be put forward about why something is the case. And usually when you write a grant, you have a little bit of preliminary data, and then you structure based on other evidence that might be sitting out in the literature why the idea that you're putting together, and you can imagine like those string boards in the detective movies where somebody's got strings all over the board on
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
wall. Basically, that's what a grant introduction and preliminary data is all about, putting that together into a framework that makes reasonable sense. And then you have to convince the reviewers that this is reasonably worthy because the goal of determining whether it is valuable, right? So there's that risk.
Completely understand. Part of that preliminary data you mentioned in another interview, as an example, is the stories of people seeing craft or UAPs.
Mm-hmm.
And that should be taken in as data, but preliminary data. So we were speaking with Rudy Schild, and Rudy Schild is now a professor emeritus at Harvard. Worked at the Smithsonian as well as an astronomer, astrophysicist. And we just had him on the show last week or the week before, and he explained to us that he would like to study the math behind the lights emitted by UAPs.
Mm-hmm.
And that he put forward last year. So he told us that he put forward last year a proposal to Harvard as a candidate to be on a committee to choose such a thing, but a proposal to design an undergraduate degree in UAP studies. And he said his pitch, I really like his style. I've begun to really like his style. His pitch was, does Harvard want to be the first to do something like this, or the
They
last?
wouldn't be. They wouldn't be. First of all, there's already a couple of courses out there on UAP. I think one at the University of Illinois, maybe. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't want to start
Yeah.
a firestorm at U of I. But yeah, I know that there's a couple out there, and I remember, and Diana Pasulka has taught one.
Yeah, in
So
North Carolina, right?
yeah, so it wouldn't be the first. Um,
He was advocating for a degree in those studies.
oh, a degree. Well, that
Yeah,
would
oh, yeah.
be, different thing. I think we're a ways from that. But it depends on a degree in what. I mean, you can always weld a an interest area onto a main area. I mean, at Stanford, for instance, we have um, in the immunology degree granting program to which I belong, we have a specialty in computation. You can be a computational immunologist, which is
Mhm.
basically about how do you use the data that you collect, the big data, as it's so called, to infer a systems level interaction of the immune system, since there's hundreds of cell types and they're all talking to each other, and it's a we don't understand it, and we don't understand it to the point where we don't understand how the immune system is subverted by cancer. But the guy who won the Nobel Prize, and in whose lab I'm actually doing a sabbatical down at MD Anderson, he's a good friend. He won the Nobel for figuring out a piece of that and showing how it could be used to save patients. And so the immunotherapy, the so-called checkpoint inhibitors, he won half of the Nobel Prize around that. So, I think that it might be that you could weld this as an interest area onto an already existing program. I mean, religious studies, I mean, they're already doing that. There are people at Rice and at North Carolina, graduate students of both of them, both at there, that are talking about UAP in a religious context as an
Hmm.
observation that people experience without claiming that they're real, just saying it's a cultural interpretation, and then talking about how that affects people. And of course, Diana's wrote some amazing books
Hmm.
about this area, and perfectly legitimate PhD. It's always about how you couch it.
Sure, sure.
It's about the subtlety of how you couch it. And so, sort of flipping back to the Saul Foundation, what we're trying to do there is to teach other academics how you can talk about this without going over the line and making yourself a target, that there's perfectly credible ways to talk about this or to ask the question.
Yeah.
And so there's a rhetoric that you have to develop to be able to withstand it, withstand the usual, there's no evidence. Well, if you're going to say that, you haven't even looked. And of course, if you ask a person who says, you said, what is it that you've actually looked at? Well, nothing. It's just a few obvious. There's nothing there. Well, it's developing, and I'm still doing this. It's developing a response profile for people to say, if they say this, you say that. If they say this, you say that.
So I've inferred this in many of the talks that I've listened to that you've given. And I can't help but think about Dean Radin, who worked at the Stargate. So we had Dean Radin, Paul Smith, who was a trainer in that program as well. We've had Russell Targon and so forth. But Dean said that he was doing great science in that program, and that they were studying that that separation, physical non-physical, is an illusion. But that
Mhm.
science he couldn't share with the outside world because of the classified nature of what he was doing. But he said he was always up against scientists in the outer community, in the non-classified community, who thought he was just working on baloney. And he was fed up with that because there was so much science that he was gathering, studying, data that he was studying, that he couldn't share with the outside world. And
Mhm.
that's what was his frustration. So I understand overlaying this with the type of rhetoric to face the rest of the world with your curiosities in your data
Mhm.
collection. I'm sorry, I'm saying this as a layperson, so makes sense.
Well, I mean, here's sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to switch subject, but if you wanted to comment on that, go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, here's the thing. So let's talk about, for instance, the recent Arrow report, which
Mm-hmm.
has been dissected, and especially by Chris Mellon. And I mean, it was uh, it was autopsy of a live patient pronounced dead by dissection. He just took the thing apart, and it was it was full of conclusions. Right?
Mm.
No, there's nothing there. We looked at this thing. There's nothing there. It's what? Okay, well, if you think there's nothing there, give me the data and the methods you use to come to your conclusion. Otherwise, your conclusion is as bad as any anecdote that says I saw a UFO. Right? So that's the first thing. They're not following the rules, and they're getting away with it. The second is the argument is asymmetric. The people who claim that there's something there and say, we have the evidence, but, our national security agreements prevent us from saying it. And then there's people who say that there is no evidence at Arrow, but Arrow has the ability to veto the people who have the evidence. So it's like playing chess, where somebody else gets to say, I'm sorry, you can't use your queen that way to take my king. Right? So the argument is asymmetric.
Yeah. It's frustrating to understand.
It's frustrating, but nobody has pointed out the fact that it's asymmetric. Or at least they haven't done it in a clean way. And so you have to get everybody saying this. You've got to get everybody pointing it out, because the debunkers throw up the usual rubbish. And, for a moment, it convinces the room. But if you come back hard, continuously and strong, they eventually realize that their rhetoric no longer operates. So that's part of this, teaching people how to argue and not get drawn in with these spurious stupidities.
In your talk, in your opening, I think it was the opening talk at the Soul Foundation conference, it was a few months ago now. You start off kind of by saying something I found noteworthy. You said, I have the tools, the interest, and I have a good friend. And you were referring to Jacques Vallée. And you then you spent some time talking about studying and bringing in other experts to study physical material that you had in your hands that were allegedly part of anomalous experiences that other people had around the world. So,
right, objects that they'd seen that claimed to have dropped something or left something behind.
And so you explain the process again. This is like a 30-minute talk. So I mean, you obviously explained it for the masses. So I thank you for that. But you talked about, again, going back to the data, that you wanted to be sure of what you were looking at in some of these objects. Can you pick out one of your favorite objects of the 3 or 4 that you mentioned in that, and explain what it is that you saw and what data you've put together to ask more questions?
Right. Well, I mean, so the first objective of this is to collect enough things to be able to see the extent to which there are similarities and differences in the materials. Almost all of the material that I've seen to date are, say, left behind molten metals. I mean, how does a pile of molten metal, 10 feet across, end up in the middle of a field, far from any place where it might have otherwise been, manufactured or carried? And so, that doesn't mean it's from a UAP. It just means it's interesting. When you associate it with an observation or a witness observations, and then police reports and pictures from the police with Polaroids of the stuff, the whole event takes on a reality of some sort. Sure. So the more you have these kinds of cases, the more, for me at least, it's worth paying attention to and saying, okay, well, look, it's unlikely that I'm going to be able to prove anything, but I can collect the data, and the data itself is interesting, which is here's the kinds of metals that are in it. Here's how they're, in one case, the Council Bluffs that I'm just talking about now. It's not fully mixed material. What does that mean? I don't know, but that's interesting. And then you have other things like the Ubatuba event, where we find extremely anomalous magnesium ratios in one of the samples. The other samples look normal. Why is that? How is that? I've got multiple examples now of molten aluminums or aluminum-rich materials. Okay, why is it always aluminum? Are there similarities? Does this imply some sort of common process that's producing them? And so, all I'm doing is saying, okay, now I have enough things that are aluminum to say, that's starting to become a pattern. What does it mean? So all I want to do is just is get out there that data, and with enough backed up methodology that says I did it credibly. And somewhere out there in the greater human, intelligence, someone might make a connection. Or, if I go to the great beyond without ever having solved it, 100 years from now, somebody might dig it up and go, oh, there's this guy Nolan who had all this data, and it kind of matches some of the stuff that now we know. Or, maybe after the aliens land on the White House lawn and say, yeah,
Right.
that was our waste disposal unit. Sorry about that.
No, so this is what I appreciate about this, because your conclusions are really questions. Your conclusion is,
Yeah.
here's the data. This is what I've done. Why?
I'm going to use that. Really good. My conclusions, to the extent that I have any conclusions, they're questions.
Yeah. So Avi Loeb taught us that as well in discussing with him, is like, why wouldn't you have a childlike mind in your question making? Like, what is stopping you from asking, why not? And just for the listener, because I recommend the listener to listen to your talk in the Soul Foundation. And again, we'll put the details in the show notes. But in a few of these, like the Socorro, the Council Bluffs, the Ubatuba material, you state in your slides that the materials show no sign of technology, but they're a clear sign of industrial process and engineering. And your question is, why? So,
Right.
Anyway, that's why I just wanted to reinforce that point.
Yeah, no, it's just why. It's just they're not naturally formed. That's indisputable. I can come to that conclusion. There's no natural process that dumps 30 pounds of iron, nickel, et cetera, in the middle of a field, above which was seen and what can only be described of as a UFO. Okay, so why? What is it? So, but I think what that's about is, in the context of trying to teach the world how to do this kind of work, is the anecdotes are preliminary data. And as I've talked many times, I've had my own experiences of a variety of types, very sporadic, but indisputable. But stories are not science. Individual stories, especially, are not science. All they can do is provide a kind of fuel for me to want to understand what it was that I saw.
Right.
And then secondarily, I want to use science to convince other people that, hey, there was something here that was worth studying. And it's a bigger thing because I'm not the only one who saw exactly the kinds of things I saw. So science is about repeatability. There is repeatability. It's just not on call. There's repeated observations of similar things. That's repeatability.
Okay. So my question is going to come out a little raw, but before that comes out, so I want to allude to the listener that we've had various people on the podcast as well who have shared those type of experience, what we call anomalies. But I think that I don't think that they're anomalies. But to go back to your experiences, you shared them with Ross Coulthard on the interview with him, and one of those experiences that you, as a kid, you saw entities in your room for a period of days or weeks. I'm not sure if I remember correctly.
Weeks, a few weeks.
And they were there. They were real for you.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you explained. That experience or that set of experiences, that is still fuel for you.
Oh yeah, it's like I can still see it in my mind. And so look, somebody could claim it was some sort of weird dream.
Sure.
Fine. Well, why did I have that weird dream that other people have had?
Mm-hmm.
And relayed the thing. And it wasn't until literally 20 years later that I came upon the explanation for what it was, even though it had always been in my mind, from the year 10 on, it was never anything that I really ever thought about.
Sure.
And so I didn't have bad dreams, but what I did have, though, is a burning need whenever I moved into a new house to put shades on the windows. I had a sort of a PTSD about it because I did have memories of something looking in the window at me. And so, and actually, funny enough, Diana relays an event like that in her book when she and I and
Tyler Durden?
Taylor, she called him, went out to that place in New Mexico where they put me in a room. When we first got to this little kind of bed and breakfast that had no shades on the window, and I just had a meltdown. I didn't know that she was there, but apparently she was sitting in a little side room when I came out to the front desk and said, I can't be in this room.
Wow.
I need a room with shades on it. Now, it's just a PTSD, and somebody could say, just because Garry had bad dreams when he was a kid. That's it. Fine. Maybe that's it. But it's those kinds of things that, again, it's like, how do I explain that? And how do I turn it into science so that I can have a conversation with my peers about it?
So how do you explain that particular series of episodes there when you were small?
That's actually the only way I explain that is by explaining all the other things first. Because it's just too weird to me. It's just like, I don't have an understanding of why things like that would show up in little boys' bedrooms. Sounds creepy to me.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, sure. And that, of course, explains PTSD. As a kid, and I don't think I was any different than anybody else, I was always spooked out by being followed up the stairs or followed down my hallway at night. I just run right into bed, and I wouldn't think about things that would creep me out. But if I did think about things, I did imagine things, I would feel like I would create them and they would appear.
Right.
I mean, that's
right. Or you, yeah.
So you said at a conference, the SALT conference, which I thought was curious because it was a more an investment centric type conference in New York. But it felt like the crowd there was very eager to hear about your experiences and your thoughts on this kind of subject. And at one point you said, I'm just going to read it out for a second here. You said, when the host asked you, what is it? What's happening? And you said, I think that it is an advanced form of intelligence, something that we don't understand, that is using some sort of intermediaries that are put here, I think you said here, as an intelligence test. So can you see what's in front of you for what it really is?
Right. And what
Elaborate.
what it really is means what's behind it. That the intermediaries in this hypothesis, in this speculation, are something that sort of a minimal viable product of what it is that you can interact with, and realize that it's not human. Realize that it is evidence of something that is not you. Evidence that it is something of a profound something behind the scenes. But taking on what Jacques Vallée would say, because I remember reading his books before I'd ever met him, Jacques uses the word absurd a lot in his discussion of people's experiences and things that they've seen. And, example is, it's absurd that a flying saucer lands in a field. Some guy gets out in a silver suit and then proceeds to fix it as if it's, a car. Opens the side panel and, twiddles with it, and then gets in and flies off. And so it's absurd. It's absurd that sometimes documents walk up to the door of the farmer and say, "Can I have a glass of water?"
Sure.
And so what his interpretation, and he's just brilliant, is, look, this is a show. This is meant to make you think and realize that it's absurd. And are you capable of realizing that it's not at face, what you're seeing is not at face value. What you're seeing is something which is meant to stimulate you to realize what's really going on, or what might be going on behind the scenes. Another way to look at it is, if you're a super intelligence that has never interacted with humanity, and you have thoughts about things that are so far afield from what a human could ever interpret, how many layers of translation do you need to go down?
Right.
To tell somebody what it is that they're seeing? And so you're going to, as best you can, fit the narrative to the cultural capabilities of the observer. So, which is why the observations change over time, right? I mean, it's an explanation. It's not actuality, but it is, the only way that I can deal with the disparities in the data. Science has to have a theory. When you have a theory, it has to explain everything. If a single conclusion is out of, sorts with the data, or is
It
contradicted,
obliterates everything. Yeah.
it obliterates the theory. So anyway.
Well, yeah, you say anyway, but that's huge. But let me go back to what you said earlier when you were recounting the story of the absurd episode as an example. Is it really meant to make us think? Is it about accessing our intelligence, or our, excuse me, accessing our thoughts rather than maybe our feeling towards it?
Oh yeah, no, feeling, emotions.
That's something different.
Something different. I mean, so it happens to a farmer in like the late 1800s, and it ends up in a newspaper clipping that Jacques finds through thorough research. And the article usually would start with Joe Farmer, an otherwise very credible individual and known by his neighbors to be
Otherwise,
high integrity, saw this. And, it comes and goes. So why would Joe Farmer come up with a story like that? So it, again, doesn't make it real. It just begs the question of something that John Mack came to with all these supposed abductions. And please, abduction community, don't come after me because I use the word supposed.
Yes.
I'm just being careful.
We'll put the warning in the show notes.
I feel your pain. So, it's either real or it's a manifestation of something deeper about human intelligence and dream states that we need to understand, from a purely conventional point of view. So no matter what it is, the question's interesting. I mean, with John Mack, he was talking about, either this is a real experience or some kind of mass psychosis, and doesn't mean
Mm-hmm.
a negative thing, psychosis. Um, but it is an example of one of those, what I call Zen questions. Two types of questions. One kind of question is the answer is yes, it's great. The answer is no, you might have wasted 6 months or more, your life. Um, and so that's a Las Vegas question. The Zen question is the answer is interesting no matter what. So you always try to ask the Zen question because then the answer is interesting no matter what. You always set up your hypothesis in a way so that no matter what answer you get, you're moving forward. And that's just a philosophy of how you do science best, in my opinion. It's just not the only way. You can just have a really good run at Las Vegas,
Sure.
but win a lot of answers through that. So, is it emotion that that's trying to be taught? I don't know. Is it an influence campaign? Certainly. The expectation is you pick the right person, um, you know, perhaps because they can perceive you and you know that they will report the thing and so you don't have to show up to everybody. If you want to influence people, you don't hit them over the head with it, everybody. Maybe you
Mhm.
sort of infiltrate it into the culture until people realize it. Maybe you don't care if most people see it or not, or understand it or not. That's not the goal. The goal is to find the people who are most intelligent and influence them over time.
Well, and maybe it's not just the most intelligent, but maybe it's those people who have let themselves into the feeling through their vocation. So,
Mm-hmm.
uh, like artists are a great example. Writers are a great example. Scientists who are conscious about hiding their intent behind the scenes while they design the programs that they want to design. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's what it is. I mean, I've met many a right brain centric person who is not necessarily uh, an intellectual, but through living their life through their feeling, um,
Mm-hmm.
gather much more wisdom than I have gathered. And there's no less value in that. But I find that those type of people. So let's call them intuits.
Intuits, yeah.
Often they know more than the rest of us. They're more aware
Well, I
than
mean,
the rest of us.
I connect more with people in, let's say, in the gay community who are more in the shamanic healing
Hmm.
uh, arena, right?
Why?
I can have a conversation with them, and because they have already come to a lot of conclusions about the way the world should be organized that um, comport with what I do. And I have a conversation with them, and I realize, you know, many scientists would just dismiss them, but these people are more often than not more in touch and in tune with the world, with the reality of the world, than are my scientist friends who probably couldn't live 5 seconds outside of the lab,
Hmm.
right? Because they're so focused. But we honor these people, or we honor the financial genius, who's made $1 bazillion. But we discard the people who have a level of wisdom that I wish we all had. They're more in touch with themselves.
Avi Loeb said to us the last thing he wants to do before he dies is to touch the button produced by another civilization. What is it that you want to know? What is your thing that you want to know before you die?
Well, he does or doesn't want to. I think
He
he says he
does.
just doesn't want it. He does. Yeah,
Yeah.
me too. If and yeah, I just want to know with some sort of finality. If all the stuff that we've been seeing is real, right? I mean, I have my strong suppositions, and I know what I saw, so I know at one level it's real. But I want the clarity that I get to say to everybody else, "I told you so." I mean, that's been my science, because I've always had an issue with convincing people that the science I want to do is real or is worth it, and then basically using their denial as the motivation and fuel for me to prove that I was right. And then, without getting too uppity about it, at the end of the day saying, "Look, I told you so." There's that
Without
little
being uppity.
moment of, without being uppity. Yeah, there's that little moment of
Fine balance.
enjoyment. I'm sure there's some complicated German word for it. There's
It's true. It's
30
true.
syllables, like Schadenfreude
Yeah.
or whatever. It would please me. That's all. And to know that I've been a part of trying to get the information out. But finally, not just that. I mean, I would want to translate some understanding of whatever the technology might be into positive human use. That's again been a motto of my life, of how to take the data and turn it into something practical that can help humans.
And that's one of your tenets, actually, of the Soul Foundation's tenet number 3. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
How do you believe you will exist after your body passes, after you die?
Oh, I have no idea. I've read so many books on afterlife kind of stuff, and they are all so sure of themselves and yet so different that obviously they can't all be true. And so, maybe the afterlife is what you want to make of it. And so they're all experiencing their own reality. And it's sort of like you get to go into a place where it comports with your expectations, because it's sort of like the ultimate virtual experience. And I don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing. I just don't know. I've spoken to plenty of people who, like, who, let's say, are mediums, Tyler Henry being one of them. I did a show with him at one point. And, he has some remarkable stories. And but he's like a scientist in a way, in that he repeatedly says, "I don't know that these are the spirits of the dead that I'm talking to," or, as I've interpreted what he said, or some sort of information space of the leftover of what they were that can be interrogated as if it were a chat GPT in the sky. Right. And, so he's open to the sense that that's what it is, but, or that it might be something far more complex than just the spirits of the dead. But, at the end of every one of the shows that he ever does, the people who are asking the questions end up in tears, because they've been talking to something that, relives the essence of their dead relative or friend. And so, if it's, I mean, Jacques often talks about all of this as an information space, and this is just organized information space. I mean, we're just organized information. I mean, the protons, et cetera, are just information. They're actually not even objects. They're weird fields sitting in a matrix of something we don't understand, space-time. And it all just condenses and coalesces into a person, and somehow that manifests in intelligence, whatever. Okay. But, does the instantiation of such a complex being imprint onto the universe a history of what it is, or a reality, and that when you die, that lingers as a soul? I don't know. There's a physicist who has some very great sort of deep. He's a very well-known physicist. Burkhard Heim is his name. You can probably find this
Or
on
card
a
Heim.
PDF of it on the internet somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And he has this, beautiful set of theories about how the complexity of nature will lead to what he would call levels of consciousness. And he has all the math. I mean, the math that I don't even understand
Is
that
that an
leads to
octopus
complexity.
there?
No, it's a two-dimensional representation of a seven-dimensional space.
Jeez,
But
of
what he
course.
says is, of course, um, you know, his interpretation of it is that when you get to that level of complexity, the object, that red object that's created at the top, doesn't need the body anymore. And really, what he's saying is that's the soul. It's just an interesting speculation. But his math is good. It's as good as any of the others, as string theory or whatever. I mean, they'll argue endlessly till the end of time about who's right about the math. But it's just, I don't know if that's real. I find it interesting. It would make a great short story, science fiction story, or maybe
Sure.
a book series. But so it's like I don't know what is after, and so in some ways, I almost can't wait to find out.
You're the first one who's actually told us, I can't wait to find out. Obviously, you are waiting and you want to wait, but I
I'm
understand.
waiting, and it's coming for all of us. So
Yeah.
I'm in a way not that worried about when it happens because maybe some of the answers might become clearer.
I mean, there's what, 8 billion of us here. Like, how many of us are
Mhm.
thinking about what's happening after I'm gone? Maybe
Mhm.
it should be part of the discourse without it
Yeah.
being morbid. I don't think it's a morbid material. What is greatness to you?
I think greatness is leaving behind a legacy of commitment to giving to others, and working, for collective benefit. I don't think it means you have to be Gandhi. I think you can still have a little bit of selfishness and enjoy your stay here. But it's, to me, it's not disparaging the interpretations or thoughts of others, for their view of what's might be going on, right? Kindness. I don't know. I mean, love. I just, but spending your time imparting to others the things that you've learned. I am lucky to have in my scientific lineage several Nobel Prize winners who imparted to me their ways and interpretations of how to do science. And then personally, I've synthesized some of those and come up with my own ways of doing it that I impart to my students and postdocs, many of whom, I mean, 7 of whom are now, tenured professors at Stanford, independent of me. Got people at Harvard, et cetera, all over the world. And so I feel like I've imparted my mental legacy, if not my genetic legacy, to them. But I've transferred things that I've learned from my mentors. And, I count amongst my mentors on this subject, Eric, Hal, Jacques, Kit Green, a few others who can't be named.
Mhm.
And it's like, okay, well, here's their little learnings, because the oral tradition is what makes humans different than chimpanzees. It was the moment of the difference that made humans a society and capable of preserving knowledge over centuries. So be part of the tradition would be my, uh, you know, summary of what makes you great, because makes you great in some ways is the influence you've had on succeeding generations.
My only comment there is, I think you might be downplaying it by calling it a mental legacy, although I've never heard it put that way. It feels like there is an energy. There's an energetic legacy that you've been building because you've been learning from others the same, and
Yeah.
that I think that's really powerful because it connotes something much larger and more universal that's already at play, and you're playing with
Hmm.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I don't know, it's very satisfying to know that you're passing on other people's learnings that you found. And there's a million ways to die. To there are few ways to live.
Yeah, unfortunately
You
agreed.
were at least.
Garry, it's been a pleasure. It was worth the while for me. And thank you for your time today. It was
Yeah.
good combo. Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right. Great.